Hello and welcome to Trust No One, the X-Files podcast, where some of my fellow agents and I will be discussing episodes of the X-Files. Today we're going to be discussing the 14th episode, directed by Michael Lang. It's called Young at Heart, and it first aired on the 11th of February, 1994. So this is a really Mulder-centric episode, and I guess I want to start today's conversation with, how does the episode deepen and develop Mulder's character?
So yeah, hi Annie.
Hi, Brad.
Hi everybody. Just two of us today, so good conversation. A lot of talking. I think we get to see some trauma that is beyond just the guilt that he has with his sister, childhood trauma. I think we see professional trauma and regret and guilt over a life that he feels responsible for. And that kind of anchors his, not his professional kind of life, but that personal component, that sense of ethic, that sense of commitment, that sense of responsibility as an adult. It's nice to see his character have that kind of passion, that's kind of anger about the criminals, the things that happened while he was doing his job.
Absolutely. I think there's deep regret, isn't there? And anger with himself, really, for complying, I think, with the book and following the rules, even though, when the rules lead to terrible outcomes, basically. And I think, we can often get caught up in the X-Files and thinking, oh, it's all the supernatural, it's Monster of the Week, it's whatever. But fundamentally, they're FBI agents. So they'll deal with cases with just, horrible individuals who force them to make really difficult decisions in that sort of split second. And I think this episode shows how those things haunt you, possibly in a more terrifying way than some of the ghosts and monsters actually do.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's really important.
Do you think this idea of following the book, the idea that he followed the procedures as outlined within, the manual, and someone lost their lives, do you think that's kind of a component of why he fights against some of those policies, some of those rules that exist now, because he followed them and something bad happened, so he's trying to avoid the same sequence of events?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that, and I think there's a really nice discussion that he has with Reggie, and Reggie said, "Oh, your instincts were just unreal. Like everybody thought you were going to be the best thing that ever happened to the FBI.
Right.
But if you follow your instincts and that goes against the book or the rules or then what do you trust?"
Right.
And there's something there about judgment, and Mulder's judgment. It gets questioned over and over again throughout this first season.
Right.
And even Reggie says, you're losing it. You're paranoid. I understand why you're called spooky now. So even Reggie doubts Mulder's gut. And so Mulder's forced in this episode to consider, does he trust his instincts? And if you can trust no one, maybe then you can just trust those instead.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it definitely gives us something. It enriches the character for the viewing audience, for sure.
Definitely. Do you think he's struggling with some sort of PTSD or, I mean, the flashback scenes work narratively, but I wondered if they were sort of trauma flashbacks in a different sense.
Well, I think in the era, right, no one would have described that as PTSD. Everyone would have described it as, shit happens, or, like everyone's got some crap that's happened in their lives. They just learn to get past it. And I think in that era, that would have been considered like, use that discomfort, use that pain to drive you to not make the same mistake, or it's like channel it. But yes, I think we would describe that now as PTSD or some type of trauma that we're carrying. And in today's vernacular, it's like we have to deal with this trauma. We have to, talk about it and wrestle with it and get past it, or or maybe not get past it, but learn to live with it. But you have to really dig into it. And I don't think that's not the era that the X Files was created in.
I think you're right. I think the fact that he doesn't even talk openly with Scully initially about it, she
Mm,
finds out because I think Reggie shows her the tape and talks her through the scene.
right.
And then she sort of comes in and he went, "Oh, he told you, didn't he? He showed you the tape." And she's like, "Yeah." So the fact that he's opened up to her about some really powerful things, even at this stage in the season, but he can't go there. And it's like, is the anger blocking that, or is it just guilt? Or, it's the first time I see them really kind of very distant from each other. And she sort of tries to get him to explain what's going on, and he just can't. He really is quite sort of locks down on it, which I think is very interesting.
I'm not sure the fact that he accepts that she knows about it,
Mm,
right? That is enough, right? It's like the first step to deepening even their relationship, because you know in the era, men didn't cry, or it was very
mm,
strange to see a man cry in some any kind of television. Or men had to be strong, they had to be stoic, they had to be this, they had to be that,
mm.
right? So talking about your feelings in that era was fairly fairly a fairly new kind of statement within some of these shows. Um, so maybe just the fact that she knows what has happened is enough for him,
Mm,
cracks the door open a little bit. But
mm.
yeah, I can imagine that it's hard to be vulnerable in that sense, right? And that's what
Yeah,
that is. It's a vulnerability.
absolutely. I mean, I think Reggie's a more sort of extreme version of that, isn't he? There's a description after Reggie's died about, well, I think I probably knew him the best, and he told me about his novel, and I was the
Right.
only person that even knew that, and
Right.
he's just such a closed book, isn't he? And it's almost like Reggie just doesn't want to go back into the past at all. And he's like, no, this isn't Barnett. There's no way. There's no way. And you can say, well, that is logical based on, the information they've got. But the fact that he really, really kicks back against it, doesn't he? To the point where it results in him dying, actually, because he's not prepared.
Well, I think what is it? I think Mulder says that I'm the only one that he trusted,
Yeah.
something along those lines.
Yeah.
And that's, in a professional world, people they compartmentalize, right? So you
Mm,
have your work relationships, you have your outside of work relationships, and you don't try to mix those two things. And
mm,
and it's an issue of trust sometimes, because you don't want people to know too much about you, or know too many of your secrets, kind of, right? So
yeah.
um I'm wondering if trust is that issue for Mulder, and Scully's earned the trust,
Mm,
and Skinner is earning the trust, but maybe he doesn't truly trust people very well.
mm. Yeah, absolutely. Do we think then, because he's obviously holding a lot of guilt about Barnett, isn't he? And what he should have done, what he could have done. Do we feel that echoes the sort of same feelings of guilt that he feels about his sister?
Yeah, it's almost it's very similar. I think it's very similar situation. He didn't do anything to try to help his sister, and his reluctance to shoot Barnett when he had the chance resulted in uh, that other agent being killed. And I imagine in his mind, he didn't do anything to save the agent, preemptively. So yeah, I'd say there's some echoes there.
I think you're right, and I think it's a different form of inactivity, isn't it? Because obviously he's chosen to follow the rules in the case of, Barnett, but with his sister, he was. I mean, he describes himself as being frozen to the spot, and
Right,
almost like just, but completely passive and completely, ineffective in his
right,
eyes. So I
right.
guess it's that same thing, isn't it? Of I didn't act when I should have acted, and
And
I've lost people, as a consequence.
maybe as a kid, you are inactive because you don't know. It's such a strange, or a new or startling experience, that you the processing of it doesn't enable you to take specific action, right? It's the fight or flight. You don't have either of those, right? You're frozen in place. But as an adult, I think it was the rules that were freezing him in place, that were holding his hand, so to speak.
Exactly, and the fact that, you know, he literally had the gun in his hand, and obviously the mirroring of that happens later is something we'll discuss a bit later in the discussion.
Yeah.
So what is the relationship? What's the importance of that relationship then with Reggie, do we think?
Well, I was thinking about that. I was wondering if Reggie was like the elder brother, surrogate father,
Mm.
was a fine. And they didn't go very far into that. They just had a camaraderie or a familiarity with each other that he doesn't seem to have with other people, or hasn't had with other people that we've seen this season. Um, yeah, I think it's a familiarity. It's a sense of trust, or a sense of knowing. It was the Scully relationship before Scully, if that makes any sense,
Yeah, I think that
right?
makes sense, and I
But
think obviously he was a new agent, wasn't he? So he was being guided
right,
through the process.
right,
Mm.
and you accept certain. Um, I think in a relationship, that in a mentor mentee relationship, you accept kind of more criticism, or you take at face value the things people say, and you take it to heart, but you don't take offense, because
Mm.
it's really somebody just speaking to you about helping you improve. It's like a coach, if you will.
Yeah.
So, you know if he felt that kind of closeness, or that kind of openness with Reggie, then that would have been a good kind of relationship to have in his developmental years as a
Mm.
professional.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, he doesn't necessarily seem to consider that Reggie's life might be at risk until almost it's too late, which I did
Mm.
find a little bit strange. You know, the fact that, you know, this guy is obviously going to go and target all the people who are closest to him, but I think he almost felt, well, Reggie's impervious. You know, he's the older one, he's the more experienced one. You know, and when they're having that quite sweet phone call, you know, it's like, oh, you're in bed, Reggie. There's no,
Right.
by the way, Barnett's definitely alive. Get out. You know, where's your gun? It's just, "Oh, you're asleep. Oh, yeah, old man," you know?
That is a bit of a. I mean, that situation does create, in my mind, um, kind of like a discontinuity between
Mm.
the paranoid, forethinking Mulder
Yeah,
and the Mulder that's presented in this particular episode. He In previous episodes, he's a bit more ahead,
yeah.
and he's a bit more paranoid. This one he's not, and
Mm.
he's more angry, and maybe it's because he's distracted with his anger. But I just think that there's something that was missing in who he presented in this particular episode.
Yeah, I agree, and it's almost like he'd kind of regressed back to the new agent Mulder, and he was sort of feeling his way through something fresh to him, which, yeah, it was strange, and I don't know if that was the script writing or if it's supposed to be where he's in a state of trauma and you know, he's not really processing this properly. It was very interesting.
Yeah, at the time, I don't think anyone would have been kind of writing it with the knowledge of,
Mm,
well, he's going through his trauma, and that's going to be distracting, and because it really wasn't an issue,
mm.
of common consideration back in the 90s.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
um,
initially, it's almost like a revenge thing on both sides, isn't it? You know, I mean, he's being hunted down by this guy who's out for revenge, and ultimately he's seeking revenge as well. And then what happens to Reggie, it becomes this additional thing of, well, now you've really done it. You know, you've killed Reggie, so now I'm really going to come after you.
right.
So yeah, it was far more like police procedural. I thought the first half of the episode actually, you
Hmm.
know, the clues and detective fiction motifs. I was like, okay, this is interesting.
Yeah, and you had the
Um,
kind of like casual relationships that you have, and
yeah.
especially between Mulder and the handwriting expert, there was a casual
Yeah,
flirtatiousness there,
that was
so
really fun. I liked
it
that.
was, yeah, it was.
Yeah. And I think it reminds us that, you know, because Scully's had these sort of people kind of flirting with her before, and it's
Mm.
like they're both super attractive, you know, really intelligent people. Obviously, they're both going to be desired. And yeah, I think she's called Henderson, I think, isn't she? she's like, oh, 10 minutes might be enough for you, Mulder. You know, all the lovely little innuendos and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And he plays into it just enough, but then
Hmm.
is always like, yeah, but. And then she's clearly very bright and clearly very good at her job as well. So, you know, you've got other very intelligent women who are interested in him as well. And I think that, yeah, that shows his kind of ability to play, but the fact that he won't get drawn into it is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, those secondary characters that do just enough to you know, don't do more than is required of them in those episodes. They're not there for anybody's. They're not
Mm,
there for their own ego. They're there to service, you know, the script. And I think that actress did exactly what she needed to do, and
mm.
memorable because of the way she delivered some of those lines, and understated as they were just perfect for that moment.
Definitely. And the fact that she's fully prepared to show off, she's like at one point,
Yeah,
oh, you know, well, it would be showing off to say he was sitting down or whatever the line is, you know.
yeah,
But actually she dropped some really important information. There's the thing about no fingerprints, there's the thing about, you know, it's definitely not a prosthetic.
right.
It's this hand, and that's a hand that obviously was cut off. So, you know, as a kind of, I remembered watching this like years ago, but I watched it again. I was like, oh, the clues are really fun, because you
Mhm,
are doing a bit of kind of Sherlock Holmes detective stuff as a
right.
viewer, and that's quite enjoyable because yeah, the salamander hand thing was not what I was expecting originally. So it's like there's
Yeah,
enough there. So I think she's really interesting, and I
yeah.
think
Crime
it's this
procedural
idea.
is a good way of looking at this particular episode.
Definitely. So, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I personally feel that Mulder's lines in this don't really give David Duchovny much to do in terms of its. Yes, he can look a bit angry and a bit upset, but to how well do you think David Duchovny portrays Mulder in this episode? And is there enough for Scully to kind of do alongside that?
Um, you know, that's an interesting question, because I think this was the more natural kind of Mulder. He
Mm,
looked more at ease. The character looked more at ease in this
mm,
episode. Maybe it's because he had a wider range of, or more subtle kind of emotional range to play.
mm.
Um, but I think he did fine. I mean, yeah, I think that it was um, a believable kind of presentation of the character, and it was less. Normally he's very excited. He's at a you know, like a 9 or an 8, right?
Yeah.
But this was more like in the mid range. He starts off at like a 4, and he builds up and he pulls back, and he's got a variety of levels. So I think he did a good job of portraying a different set of kind of emotions that
Mm.
than he would normally be expected to portray.
I think there's some really nice bits actually. There's the flashback bit where he's in the court
Yeah.
and he just starts to lose it and you see it, and it's just the bit of yeah, and he shot her in the face or whatever, you know, it's just horrible stuff that, but he's really losing control, and I think that's dealt with really well and escalates brilliantly. So I really liked his performance in that part. I think overall he just seems so kind of distant and far more like a professional FBI agent, funnily enough. um because of the nature of the case, or you know, the fact that he was being drawn back into it and it was
In that
sort of
flashback.
yeah, I think so.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, he you definitely got a sense of him as a younger agent before he realized that the book was corrupt and the book led to, you know, horrific outcomes. It's like, look, I've followed the book and here I am in court and this guy's just there and this isn't justice. And you can see that. You normally see that
Mm,
kind of breakthrough point, which I think is
mm,
really, really effective actually. And there's still comedy at the start, isn't there? There's a little play and back and forth, but he's far more kind of on it and he's far more serious, I think, in this.
mm.
Hmm.
I liked
I wonder-
his first moments with Reggie, the character Reggie, and there was like I said, there was familiarity there, and even how they were talking. There was a little kind of moment where there was a little flutter in his laugh,
Yeah,
right, which is seemed sincere. It seemed, you know, like it would be if you were just truly meeting up with a friend, and after a while, and you know, chuckling about past events, you know. But of course, it
definitely.
seemed odd that it was that way as they were discussing a murder.
Mm.
So maybe that wasn't such a good thing.
Yeah, it's definitely some interesting choices, I think, in terms of the way the script's been pulled together. What about Scully in this episode then? Is there much to say about her in this?
Well, Scully was supplanted by Reggie,
Mm,
right? But
yeah.
it was almost as though the things that Mulder needed to hear could only have been said by the mentor, not the partner. And it
Mm,
wasn't until after Reggie's death that Scully had a bigger role to play
mm.
in the development of the final act of the story. But maybe Reggie's in part was to give us that history, that early years of the FBI kind of experience.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. I think like you say, Scully's sort of forced to almost be the audience in a way and just be
Mm,
like, yeah, but what is that and what happened and kind of asking the questions that we want to ask, and learning a lot about Mulder as a consequence of that. Um, but she's quite interesting in this because I don't think she questions him. Reggie's the one that says, yeah, but it's not Barnett, is it? Or it's quite antagonistic with him. Whereas Scully never seems to do that really. She's just like, right, okay, and now what? And now what? So she almost feels like it almost feels like she's sort of either on the back foot or sort of just stood beside him, just sort of like, I'm just going to kind of watch and see what's going on here. And yeah, by the end, where she obviously has to be the bait, effectively,
yeah.
she's like, "Oh, I've never not played this role before," and I thought, well, actually, you've not played this role at all in terms of what you've just done throughout the whole episode. So, yeah, I think she's really interesting in it, actually.
There's a bit of tension between them as well, right? When
Yeah,
he says you're basically you're Don Quixote tilting at windmills, right?
yeah,
You're seeing ghosts, and
yeah,
his retort is, "I thought you didn't believe in ghosts,"
yes,
right?
which
It
is
seemed a
brilliant.
little bitterness in that,
Yeah. I think that's it. I think he's quite angry about everything and everyone, and
right?
it's just spitting everywhere. Um, and there's that bit where it's Barnett. I just feel it, and it's the fact that, well, but what do you mean you just feel it? It's a very unmoldery thing to sort of say. He'll often say like, I believe, or no, you've got to question it or whatever. But he'll have an argument for it, and he'll have
Right.
evidence, and then he pulls out the file and he's like, and by the way, da da da, and he completely convinces whoever that yes, actually that's a completely valid thing. But with this, it's like there's something that's really missing there, and I
Yeah,
think
it's
he's quite worried about him.
like a faith, like
Yeah.
he's falling into that. It's a mystery. It's God works mysterious ways kind of
Mm.
realm, and he's talking about his feelings, and it's a new territory for him, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so we've got to talk about Barnett, right? So, what do we think then? Because Barnett obviously starts off, one of the things about him is he's a prisoner and he's experimented on
Yeah.
because he's a prisoner, which obviously puts him in a really vulnerable position. And whether you like the guy or not, it doesn't really matter. Like he is a human being who's been experimented on. Does that status of like vulnerable prisoner, abuse victim, does that create any pity for him, or are we just like, no, he's evil and he deserves it?
Well, it harkens back to many different eras of our recent past,
Mm,
where people who are deemed to be criminals lose all their rights and become easy targets for abuse or exploitation, right? And it has happened, as we know, where prisoners have been used for medical experiments and
yeah,
scientific experiments, but there's lots of recent history in the world where criminals are slave labor and they're
yeah,
used, right, to do things. um, so this is just a continuation of that.
mm,
um, but as and that's wrong. Period. It's just
yeah,
wrong. But as to whether or not Barnett is a pitiable character,
mm.
I would say no. He doesn't deserve what he gets, but I have no feeling of empathy
Mm,
toward him at all. He
Mm.
seems to be he seems to have no remorse and no sense of reflection, no sense of regret. And he seems very sociopathic. And in that case, if he can't feel emotions for others, then we shouldn't be feeling emotions for him.
Oh, that's interesting. So we're saying it's still, or you're saying it's still problematic that he's being tested on because no one deserves that. But because of who he is as an individual, it's very hard to feel any kind of personal sympathy. Is that about
Yeah,
right?
I would,
Mm.
if I was making an argument, if I was a lawyer making an argument, I wouldn't be making an argument that he
Yeah.
has his rights abused or he didn't deserve to be
Mm.
mistreated, but
Mm.
rather no one deserves to be mistreated. And I'd be making a larger, more broader argument because he's irredeemable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a line in there, isn't there, where Dr. Mengele is kind of referenced, and obviously then we're talking about Nazi concentration camps and various other things. But I think there's also kind of an allusion to, well, prisoners are the property of the state, effectively, and
Right.
like you say, labor camps and everything else. It's like, well, what is an acceptable use of those people? Is there an acceptable use, or is even the notion of using people, in those circumstances appalling? And like, it made me think about a lot of the experiments that have been done on kind of armed forces over the years, and like,
Right.
I mean, there's Gulf War scandals, there's all sorts of things, but I mean, even if you don't get into the Gulf War syndrome thing, which can be seen as slightly complex. I mean, there was LSD experiments in the 50s, there was like radiation testing on the 40s and 50s, and like, and what I didn't know, which I found sort of looking up some stats on this, was like since 1992 apparently in the US and the UK, every member of the armed forces has had to give biological samples, so DNA samples,
Mm-hmm.
and so ultimately they're being used as a kind of resource, even if it's just a data resource. And that's the armed services, not even prisoners. So, and
Right.
most prisoners obviously have their bio data taken. So it did get me thinking about like the vulnerability of those populations who have to place absolute either trust or they have got no choice anyway in the people who are supposedly caring for them.
Yeah, I think my personal belief is that if you're if you're incarcerated or imprisoned, the current method or the current reason or rationale is to
Mm.
separate you from society and prevent
Mhm.
any continuation of the crimes against society that you've been found guilty of perpetrating.
Mm.
Um, we in Canada are trying to move toward a kind of a responsive model where we integrate kind of psychological
Mhm.
and retraining, and we're
Yeah.
trying to address the underlying social issues. Um, and you know, some is success and
Mm.
some not, right? But um, I think there's an argument to be made for people who are on the in prisons, finding a way to provide some kind of return for the costs of their incarceration.
Mm.
And I don't know what that is. I don't know how that what that looks like. As long as it doesn't violate their rights and create issues for them, their health. I think there are things that can be done. Perhaps there should be done. Retraining is part of that for me. The person gets to be trained in a career or a job that needs to be accomplished, so they have opportunities beyond their incarceration. But
Mm.
the medical experiment stuff is wrong. It's just
Mm.
it's not right, and um, unfortunately, science and governments and they're all kind of nefarious actors. So um, I just don't believe that that is slave labor, right? Putting
Mm.
people to work
Mhm.
like they did in the 30s and the 40s.
Mhm.
It's not right,
Mm.
right?
Absolutely. And I think with that in mind, it's like when I was watching it, I didn't feel like a huge sense of pity for Barnett as a human being, like as an individual, sorry.
Right.
But I did in terms of, actually this is somebody who very unwillingly had this procedure done to him, and then has then basically been kept alive as a successful experiment. And
Mm.
and I did think, not that it would make a very good X-Files episode, but if he did have the right to compensation, or I mean, what he's arguing for basically is he's got the right of revenge, that he deserves vindication for what he's been through. But I'm really curious about why Barnett pursues Mulder instead of Ridley. I mean, Ridley's the one that did this thing to him. He doesn't seem to value it as a precious gift. He seems to see it as some sort of, you know, I don't know. So why do you think he doesn't want revenge on Ridley?
You know, Mulder caught him, or Mulder was part of the team
Mm.
that caught him, right?
Oh,
So
is it because he put him in prison? That's who he blames for it
took
all
away his
happening.
freedom, right? And then
Yeah,
everything that fell on him after that is a consequence of that initial,
right.
right? And
Yeah, makes sense.
I don't know, why do psychopaths or sociopaths do anything, really? You
Well,
know,
yeah, that's a whole other layer, isn't it? It's
um,
like, mm,
you know, it's yeah, it's just it's hard to it's hard again. I understand what it is you're saying,
mm,
right? But it's hard for me to feel pity for that character, or have any kind of emotional connection for that character. He did too many things that put other people's lives in jeopardy, and
yeah.
yeah, it was just yeah.
What do you think about the fact that he taunts him then? I mean, there's the weird cryptic rizzles and, all that sort of stuff. Is that just, do you think he takes great pleasure in that? Is he sort of sadistic in his pursuit of Mulder?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. He's,
Do you think
he's
he thinks he's smarter than Mulder then? Because, I mean, obviously he's got like the ultimate disguise, hasn't he? Because he's youthful looking now, but
No, but that's the whole point. It's a game, as they said in
mm,
this show. It's a game, and in games, you want to be the winner.
mm,
Doesn't matter, right? And he seems to be the kind of guy that would cheat at any
yeah,
game,
I'd
right?
agree with that.
Even
Yeah.
even with even with a child, he would cheat to get the win.
Yeah.
So this is his way of winning, right? You punish the person, you punish them by taking away their family and their friends, and you know
Mm.
it's very schoolyard with an adult psychopathic twist.
So is Mulder outwitted? Do you think he's very lucky that actually he manages to get him in the end?
I don't know. I don't know
Mm.
if he's lucky. I think it was a necessary contrivance of the script to have them come full circle, and give Mulder a chance to rectify a
Yeah.
past choice, that is driving him. That is weighing on his heart. You know, so I don't think there's anything more to it than just convenience, and they had to
Mm.
wrap up the story. So let's put him somewhere.
It did feel a bit sort of accelerated towards the end, didn't it? It was a bit like, right, we've got a lot of explaining to do and a lot of things, and we need to get them in the room together so that
Well,
obviously Mulder can shoot him.
did Scully's friend tell on the answering machine what hall she was going to be at?
I know,
Nope,
exactly.
nope. But they all knew where.
It's like, oh yes, the only cello concert in the whole of the town. Let's go there.
That's
So
right.
yeah, it was quite entertaining. Um, what said some of those notes I found quite enjoyable. Fox can't guard the chicken coop and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah,
What's the meaning of that? Or do you think it is just a bit nonsensical? It was a bit Alice through the looking glass for me, but
yeah, yeah. The chicken coop being, who's the chicken? Is
yeah.
is 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 he the chicken, and is that like the prisoner, and Mulder can't catch him, can't keep him where he's supposed to be? Is that what it is? You can't catch me. I'm too good. Even as a lowly chicken, I'm smarter than you. You know, I don't know.
It was
Again,
weird.
yeah, just a contrivance. Just somebody somewhere, some writer went, "Oh, I this will be fun." I wrote it together.
Yeah. I kind of hope it was just a little bit of a weird nonsensical thing because, yeah, it
I'm
was
sure it
certainly
was. Yeah.
weird. Yeah. What do we think of the 2 Barnett performances then? Because obviously we've got the older and the younger.
You know, like I said, they're secondary characters to me are really important that they just do their role and have their bit. I think the older Barnett, I think he was pushing the boundary for me.
Mm.
He was really overplaying some things, and
Mm.
the second guy really overplayed it. So I wasn't a fan of the younger Barnett.
Mm.
The elder
I
Barnett I
think
could tolerate, but the younger was there's too much intensity,
mm.
right? And not good intensity. Not good. There's a difference between those two, right?
I thought the younger guy was much better when it was just his voice. I thought the voice on the phone acting was actually quite nice, and I love those half shots of like the half shadow face and
Mm,
glimpses, and he gets
mm,
that lovely line about this is the land of the free. Like, I was
mm,
like, oh, this is actually really good, like creepy voice stuff. But
mm.
yeah, then when he kind of like when you saw all of him, he was less terrifying.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and yeah, it was just a bit like, here I am, let's do this now. Woo, I'm gonna leap around a little bit. I mean, it's set in a bloody opera hall, wasn't it? I mean, obviously it was going to be dramatic, but yeah, I thought that was interesting. I thought the older Barnett definitely had more gravitas and more kind of creepiness. But I think
Yeah.
because of some of the episodes before this, we've had such amazing
Mhm.
villains, or I think yeah, for me these were a little bit kind of yeah, okay, sure, but I'm not even convinced that you're entirely as evil as you're purported to be. You're certainly not
Well,
as chilling. So
the elder Barnett, if he just stuck to the face, just kept his
yeah,
intensity. But there was that moment when he was playing with his hands,
yeah.
and I'm thinking, little too on the nose for what actually happens to you later. But play with the
Yeah.
hands, like, "Arr."
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then there was just, I think that might have been directing,
Mm.
but it just seemed awkward and unnecessary, really
On the
unnecessary.
subject of hands as well, I did find it really funny that when Mulder's briefing them all in the opera house and is like, okay, so he could look like any of these. Why not say the guy with the salamander hand, or he's going to be wearing gloves? Like, that's surely the most identifiable feature, right?
That's right.
Like, it's not
That's
going to be
right.
that many people doing that look. So yeah,
It's like,
again,
some writer forgot to mention the
yeah,
gloves.
yeah, exactly. It's like, of course, he's in there tuning the piano with his gloves on, like nobody ever does. So,
Silly,
yeah,
yeah.
it was quite amusing. So did the close-up then of the two pairs of eyes successfully kind of link the older and the younger Barnett? Did that feel like enough?
Yeah, it was fine, but I was confused actually. I don't know how you felt about it, but
Mm,
when the doctor also had the
I
eyes,
know.
right?
I
I
thought that
didn't.
was him for
Yeah,
a moment. Yeah. I
there
was like,
was.
oh no, he's not the doctor at all. He's actually him.
Yeah, there was just
Yeah.
a little too much of that going on. At the
Yeah.
beginning, I know why they did it, but
Yeah.
then suddenly two people had the same eye issue, and it becomes
Mm.
less clear.
Yeah, definitely. And it was quite convenient that Ridley was just like, I've only got a month to live. I'm just going to dump all of my information on you here. It's like, are
Yeah,
you?
very convenient.
Very, very helpful. Thank you. So,
And even that actor, right?
mm,
I mean, okay, I know what he was going at. I know what he was going for,
yeah,
but even he was there was nothing. There was no subtlety in
no,
the way he portrayed it. So it
mm,
wasn't a likable or memorable, right,
yeah.
moment.
And we've seen really good portrayals of kind of evil scientists and things before, like Eve, for example. I just think it's a fantastic performance. But
Yeah.
it's a similar thing. It's genetic modification. It's this idea of playing around with the cutting edge of gene therapy and science, whatever else. And you can do it in a really chilling way, where it's very clear that you don't care about the subjects at all. As Dr. Ridley just didn't seem nasty enough, I guess, or cold enough, maybe. But
Mm,
I don't know. I mean, I suppose, like, yeah, he had a month to live. What's he got to lose? But also, why bother? If like, why would you say community for a month to live? It was, yeah, it felt a little bit forced, I think.
contrived, yeah.
Yeah, agreed. So
Oh,
thinking along that line then, I guess the science, of this particular era was fascinating. I mean, you had the genetic code stuff that we've talked before about when we discussed Eve. Did the scientific references to progeria kind of enhance the story then? Because I did, yeah, I researched the disease and it is horrendous and like it's a very, very rare thing. But do you feel that enhanced it? Was that useful?
well, again, and thinking about the era, right,
Mm,
when this was filmed, genetics were just becoming kind of a component of popular
mm,
lexicon, popular
mm,
conversation, right? People were more aware of the Human Genome Project and what was being done, and then the genetic defects that are caused by certain conditions or certain
mm,
things. So, um, yeah, I think it was probably used as a convenient kind of shock value, right?
mm,
Um, for the for the episode. I'm not sure.
mm.
I mean, they try to bury it within all this science,
Yeah.
um, but it was probably something that most people didn't know a lot about, or maybe even anything about.
Mm,
And I didn't. Looking at it now, I didn't like that moment where they were watching, these children with
yeah,
progeria being,
yeah.
paraded in front of the camera. And I know what they were trying to do with that,
Mm,
but it does seem exploitive.
mm.
That's
It's a
that's
really yeah, it's a really interesting one. So that girl that you see, um, was a real person with
mm,
progeria.
yeah.
She was a fan of the show apparently. So
Okay.
when the researchers were looking into this, they were saying that we need some footage of basically someone struggling with a disease to be alongside a doctor, and they got put in touch with Courtney, and Courtney and her parents were like, "Yeah, we'd love to do it,"
Okay.
and so flew them out and but yeah, I mean, that part that made me feel a little bit better, but I was also like, oh my goodness, this does feel I don't think you'd do that today. I really don't. It was a really interesting thing. Um, but then it was interesting, there was an interview with her and she was like, oh, the more people know about this illness
Right.
potentially, the more it'll get discussed, the more funding, da da da. Da. So it's an interesting one though, isn't it? When you have got, victims of what would have been called a genetic deformity then, and it's like how is that presented and is that okay to really kind of involve that? So
Yeah,
yeah.
our modern sensibilities now, wrapped up as they are with representation and diversity,
Yeah.
but also fair representation. It's
Mm,
everything is really clouded now, and we see more nefariousness in innocent choices than we used to, and we're
yeah.
much quicker to judge than we used to be, because
Mm,
judgmentalness is uh is an acceptable thing now.
yeah.
Quick to judge. Everyone is very
Yeah.
quick to say that's wrong or that's bad or you're a bad person because you
Mm,
said that thing 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And it's a crazy time, but
yeah.
it's elevating some of our sensitivities about some of these things. We just have to have a more balanced kind of thought about how they're actually playing out instead of being so judgmental about it. Actually have conversation about it and see where
Mm.
it takes us.
Absolutely. I think it was quite interesting because obviously the progeria is then used as this kind of, well, if this is what happens with accelerated aging, surely we can identify the gene and tweak it and maybe
Mhm.
even reverse the aging. So it works in terms of a plot device, isn't it? But I mean, there's clearly like Dr. Ridley is being presented as, a member of medical science and, who runs amok. And
Yeah,
so is
a
this a
mad
criticism of
scientist, right?
that,
Yeah,
yeah, like an evil scientist, like a Dr. Frankenstein or,
yeah,
Mengele, who's sort of name dropped. So is that an era specific criticism, or do you
yeah.
think
I
that's
think so. I
universal?
think
Yeah.
a lot of the episodes we've seen so far in the series have been almost like a warning of what
Mm,
could, if we're not careful about technology, look what's going to happen. If
mm,
we're not careful about, if we're not mindful about the species that exists on the planet with us that we're unaware of, if we're not prepared to understand, explore, and figure things out, if we're not prepared to, be, concerned about pollution or this
Mhm.
or that, the world is going to react against us. And I think this era of, in the 90s, again, right? Genetic manipulation, genetic exploration. If we were not careful, at the very least, some people could react, or some people could do things um, that are wrong,
Mm.
create chimera, right? Combinations of traits of different species, and
Mm.
that was a big worry at the time. Not just animals or insects or species, but actually viral, right? Viruses, and
Yes.
manipulating those. So yeah, I think this is a commentary about someone who starts off kind of thinking, well, I think this would be beneficial to the human race, but really they don't care about the people they're experimenting on.
Mm.
It's just science run amok. Just because
Well,
we can do a thing doesn't mean we should do a thing.
and this is the thing, isn't it? The morality and philosophy of science is so important and will continue to be, and I think is more important now than ever. I didn't realize until I started looking into some of this kind of experimentation stuff that NATO has funded a project since the 1960s that looks at, like you say, chimera. So blending together different parts of animals and species and viruses
Mm,
to basically enable a form of humanity to exist beyond Earth. So it's completely fascinating. And obviously in the 90s with the genetic code, took this massive leap forward. So yeah, and that's been a project that's been continually funded since that time. So it's completely fascinating. But with that
Good.
in mind, like I find the salamander hand completely irrelevant. I don't know if this is just me. I was just like, surely if he'd become a young Barnett, that's impressive enough. Why do you need to give him a salamander hand? What's that
Because
for?
he had no hand.
But does he need a
That's
hand?
that's the fantasy of the whole thing. That's the X-File part of it.
I just found it hilarious. I couldn't take that bit
Well,
seriously at all.
Dr. Frankenstein, you freakish monster, your
Yeah,
combination of species, your chimera of sorts, right?
but
I mean, there
why?
was yeah, it does seem ludicrous. It
I
does
guess
seem
just because you
ludicrous.
can, right? So why wouldn't you if you can
It's
experiment?
the
Why wouldn't you?
shock value of it,
Yeah,
right? That's
yeah,
what it
yeah.
is, right? You
Yes.
had the idea of genetically regeneration of limbs, right?
Mm.
And even today, there's regeneration of spine, of a spinal tissue, right, to help
Yeah,
heal paralysis.
yeah.
This is the area we're moving into, but no one is suggesting that we need to, you know, develop a subspecies of Homo sapiens that have
Mm.
gills to be able to breathe underwater, right?
Mm.
But should someone ever make that idea, make that suggestion, right? We're back to square one. We're back to where we are right now.
Mm.
You know,
Absolutely. So I guess there's the question of, with the experimentation, I mean, I think it's Ridley says, the man who gets to control the
right?
fountain of youth would rule the world, right? Which makes complete sense when you look at
Yeah,
the industries around that,
right.
commercial and otherwise. So what is the attraction then of delaying aging and eternal life? And if you could, would you? So if you
Well,
had the power to become younger again or stop aging now, would you and why?
Well, there's scientific research recently continuing to be done. I
Mm,
just was listening to the National Public Radio here in Canada
mm.
to an article of an interview with a scientist who was exploring telomeres.
Yeah.
So this is the caps on the ends of chromosomes within
Hmm.
cells, and the telomeres control aging as the cap shrinks with
Yep.
with the splitting, right?
Yep.
Um, when they become so small, then the cell dies and cannot regenerate or cannot
Mm.
divide.
So it's
So
putting that into stasis.
no, it's about regenerating the
Oh,
caps.
okay. So actually, okay,
So
interesting.
if you can regenerate the cap, then you reverse aging, right? The
Oh,
cell can
wow.
continue to divide, and you can continue to stay fairly young and fairly. And this is the research that's currently
Wow.
being done, and I could not afford that. Even right. You imagine that today
Hmm.
it would be created.
Mm.
It would instantaneously create a subdivision or a division in society: the
Yeah.
haves and the have-nots, the
Yeah.
perpetually young and the naturally aging fodder, right? And there would be no combination. There would be no merging of those two. They would create
Mm.
a strata:
Hmm.
the young and wealthy, and the old and decrepit, or those
Yeah.
destined to be that way, right? And yeah, I don't know how else that could possibly develop. The human race is not. We have too many people on the planet as is,
Mm.
and continually growing.
Mm.
If the ruling class of people were to be perpetually young, they need people to farm for them to always give them enough food to survive. But they don't really care if those people are around in 80 years, because
Mm.
there'll always be new ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then it would become a sort of, well, who would pay for and take care of the elderly? Because it certainly wouldn't be the elite, because why would you bother?
The
So
whole society would be structured around
yeah.
euthanasia at
Yeah.
65,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. Which would
That's
be a
how.
really yeah.
So there's lots of film and television and literature from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s
Mm.
and 70s that postulate that kind of world
Mhm.
where the elites are in charge and everyone else is, some kind of underclass.
Mm.
So would I, and part of it also is, would you want to live forever? Right?
Uh-huh.
Would you want to go through that? And I
Mm.
I don't think I would,
No, I definitely don't
because
want to.
you'd lose everybody that you'd know, and
Yeah.
you'd eventually lose your mind and lose an appreciation of what life really is.
Yeah, and I think life is precious because it's finite, personally, but it's an interesting one. So if you had that research then, if you found that research in a locker, which is where it's implied that it's been stashed, what would you do with it? Would you destroy it? Big question. Most important one, Agent Brad.
What would most people do? They'd be, right now I'd be worried that people would think of it as a resource, and damned be, the consequences on anybody else but themselves. If they can make a quick
Mm.
buck, then they would. Um, Me, I don't think I'd understand what the hell I found.
Yeah, fair
Right?
point.
So I'll be like some kind of scientific material, and I
It
don't
might
know.
say "Secret of Eternal Youth," Brad, on the front.
Sure, if it said "Secret of Eternal Youth," then I'd hoard that thing in my room, trying to learn the secrets. But
Yeah, nice.
but yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
What would you do? What would you do?
I'd absolutely destroy it. I don't see any positive outcome of having that,
You
I think
wouldn't read it
people
first?
well, I mean, apparently now, like, people that are born, like, in this year, on average, will live till they're 100. I'd say that's a hell of a long time
But
already.
but you wouldn't read the damn thing first. You'd just say
Oh,
"Secret of Eternal Youth," and you'd go, "Whoop, burn that puppy." Whoosh.
I'd give it to you, Brad.
No, come on, I don't buy that. You'd
No,
you'd
of
at
course
least
I'd read
you'd,
it
you'd
first.
at
I'd be
least
completely
peruse the first
fascinated by it.
chapter.
I would be completely fascinated by it, but I think and it's hard, isn't it? Because if it's just, like, on your shoulders, but it's like the invention of the atomic bomb. The argument is, if you
Right.
knew how to do that and you could see the consequences, and we've just talked through the consequences, and none of them are looking good.
No.
S
Nope.
but then presumably if you have a breakthrough in that science once, then it's possible it would happen. Say, is it inevitable? It would be interesting. Um so one of the things I really love about this episode is the music. I think Mark Snow's had an absolute field day doing the music to this one. What do you think of the music?
I thought the music was serviceable. mm, what it was supposed to do, which was to enrich the kind of moment by moment kind of tapestry of the story that they were trying to tell.
Mm,
Um, it's it's always a tricky thing
mm,
to correctly pair text and action with music that doesn't sound just canned or you know
yes,
stereotypical of a moment. But I think that was done well.
definitely. I mean, I think for me, it's like I loved the kind of Omen-esque kind of mood that built and built and built and got creepier and creepier. And the fact they were in a
Mm.
concert hall, it was obviously going to escalate into something ridiculous, wasn't it? But it absolutely did, and I loved that because it was such a grandiose kind of final scene.
Do you think it was? Do you think the episode was kind of like a nod to like a noir kind of some of
Yeah,
those heavy shadowed moments, right?
yeah, 100%. It was a weird mashup between, yeah, classic noir and like detective fiction and just all of those things. And it was some of it was even quite Sherlock-esque, wasn't it? Of
Mm,
like,
yeah,
the maniac who leaves notes and those sorts of things. So yeah, I
that's
I
true.
really liked that. There's definitely things I'd change about the dialogue and plotting, but I think the theatricality of this I really, really enjoyed.
Mm.
What do you think about that final standoff then between Mulder and Barnett in the hall with the cellist?
Eh, they were fine. You
Did
know,
you not love that? Was it too much? You were saying earlier you thought he was too dramatic in that, though.
yeah. I mean, yeah. By this point, you see the progression, right? You can X Files was fun was interesting at the time, and they did break away from kind of like the formulaic model
Mm,
in several episodes, right? But there were still moments like this, a crime procedural. You have to always end with the bad guy getting caught,
yeah,
right? So you knew what was going to happen, and
yeah,
it was just a matter of there were just a couple of things that threw me, like how did they know which concert hall this was going to happen in, and you
yeah.
know anyway, so getting him there and the cellist, putting a cellist at risk like that seems very not
I know.
FBI.
She should definitely have been undercover.
Right.
Well, we should be an agent, wouldn't she? I mean, there's no way you'd have the real cellist there. So there were so many holes in that final thing.
And then
I
the
still enjoyed it, but it was plot wise rubbish.
and today, if it had been done today, right, the cellist would have been an FBI agent, and it would have been a
Exactly.
up and coming young female FBI agent who
Yes.
waited for the correct moment, and then grabbed that wrist, broke it, spun him over so that he disarmed him and put him down on the floor, and then would have been left with Mulder going, "Good job, agent." She would have
Yeah, and then
smiled
she
up at
just
the
would have
camera
played
in a
the
nice kind of
cello,
way. Yes, and then
and
she would
Mulder
have
would have
reached
got
up
the
and gone,
piano.
ding, 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 ding.
Exactly, it would have been glorious. Oh, the
Glorious.
simplicity. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, Mulder has to shoot Barnett, doesn't he? And
Has to.
it's just inevitable in every way. And like, I mean, yeah, and then of course he has to end up in the kind of operating theatre, sort of being spoken to there. And that CIA agent is William B. Davis, isn't it? It's CSM, cigarette smoking man. What do you think about that slightly surreal choice then of him being, oh, some CIA agent? They know what he looks like. Scully's been in offices with him.
Yeah.
So what was that about, do you think?
They needed a body, and they didn't have anybody on set.
She really, yeah, really.
That's it.
Wow.
I don't think it was anything more than that.
Wow. I thought
You
that
know,
was so weird. I didn't get it at all. I was like, this is so bizarre. Yeah, it certainly felt for me that the final third of that episode was rushed and thrown together,
yeah.
and yeah, wasn't as coherent as it needed to be,
Well,
really.
one of the things I had thought about writing down as a question was,
Yeah.
in the modern era, we have seasons that are running on average about 10 or 12 episodes, sometimes as few as 6, right? For
Absolutely.
special ones,
Yeah.
8 8 to 10 is usually the range.
Uh-huh.
12 seems like on the outside nowadays.
Yeah, yeah, agreed.
So you can take the same amount of money that you're spending over 30 years ago, a 22 or 24 episode run
Mm,
in a season,
mm.
and force it into a 12 or 10 episode run, right? So you get to save a little bit of money, and the money that you do end up spending is more impactful because you don't have to shortchange every episode for budgeting, right?
Yeah.
You get a bigger budget. So I wonder if we're starting to get into that as we did with an earlier episode where they were kind of shortchanged with budget and they were trying to make
Mm,
do.
mhm.
If this was one of those other kinds of shortchanged episodes trying to make
Yeah.
do, right?
Yeah,
If
that
they
makes
were
a lot of
rushing it.
sense. Yeah, because I mean there weren't big special effects or anything in this really, apart from the creepy hand. But, you know.
I would big special effects, big special effects.
I guess like there was nothing being blown up. There wasn't hundreds of different like settings, were there? They were all like pretty much internal shots. Yeah, there was a concert hall, but you know, it wasn't like they were having to build a submarine or, you know, create worms that wiggle around, you know, at will. It's like,
That's true. That's true.
yeah.
Just one plastic glove, and that's all you needed.
Yeah, full of goo. Maybe that's why they put the hand in. They were like, we haven't used any special effects budget. Let's do something.
That's right.
Let's have a salamander
Salamander
hand.
hand.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
got it. Salamander hand.
Apparently, one nice bit of trivia was the scene where the salamander hand chokes Reggie to death. They filmed that in a whole load of graphic detail, and it went on for a very long time. And his death was supposed to be very, very horrific and theatrical, but they wouldn't let it go through. Like the network wouldn't put it on. They were like, "It's too violent. It's too creepy. It's too weird." And I'm like, "Huh." So that's an interesting one. So that scene was cut right down.
Bionic salamander hand.
Bit too chilling, apparently.
That's
We
right.
can do all sorts of other weird things, but yeah.
Ripping out the throat and blood
Yeah,
spilling
yeah.
everywhere.
Completely reasonable, but salamander hands, no, step too far. So
That's right. We don't want to show those amphibians uprising.
well, you know, as we all know, we are ruled by the lizard people, so maybe the salamanders are the true gods of our modern era.
Maybe that was why it was cut too close to the too on the nose, as they say.
Those in positions of power said no to the salamander hand.
That's right.
Makes sense. Perfect sense. Okay, so I think it's time for X's out of 10 then, Brad. Tell me your X's out of 10 and why.
6 out of 10. I thought it was a fine episode for some of the. For me, it's all about the story, the history of the main characters, and how the main characters interact, and whether or not the supporting characters support that journey or that story. So I think they did an okay job of adding to Mulder's history and giving us a little bit more about who he is and why he is the way he is, giving us a chance to resolve one of those painful moments of his past, and having Scully there, underutilized as she was, perhaps, getting a chance to meet another character. And then some of the supporting roles, right, became like a crime procedural, as we already said. So it was a little bit predictable. And like I said, you can't have the main character or the villainous lead just chew the scenery as badly as they do, right? So for me, it's a 6. That's why.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. I'm a 6.5 because I think the sound and some of the shots were really, really beautiful. And I really, really liked the first half. I think the first half works really well. I think it's fascinating backstory. I think second half it's got some issues. And it's not one that sticks with me. Like I've watched it, I've enjoyed it. It didn't make me really want to watch it again and again. Whereas others, I really love the experience of reliving it. Thought it was functional, but raised some interesting questions. But I feel distracted us with the salamander hand. So
yeah, there you go.
I will get over it one day, possibly.
It's not one of those ones you want to watch again and again and again. And
no,
again.
It's not. And I think there's just it doesn't get into kind of the subtleties of the characters in the same way. But I appreciate that it's useful backstory. And I was sad when Reggie died because I thought he was great. So fantastic. Well, thank you, panelist Brad, for joining this discussion today. Thank you, Ms. Annie Agent Bennett as well. Indeed, well done us. We hope that you, our viewers, have enjoyed it as well. Let us know in the comments section what you think about the episode, and please remember to like and subscribe to the video. And we will see you all next time. The truth is still out there.